Okay. So Mike Ivey is our speaker this morning. Mike has served on our board and he provided our weekly email updates for a long time. I listened to one of his previous talks, and in the intro Jane was giving for that talk, she mentioned that Mike claims to have lots of opinions about nearly everything. Mike might be laughing a little bit. So today he is going to share his questions about consciousness with us. So, thank you, Mike.
Okay. Yes, I have opinions about everything and I love to share them. So it's purely coincidental that this talk is on Halloween. It really doesn't have a Halloween theme, but it does eventually get a little metaphysical. So anyway, during summer, some of us in the UUCH Friends email group had a couple of interesting discussions. First, there was a lengthy exchange concerning whether consciousness continues after death. Then there was a brief discussion about artificial intelligence that included the issue of whether there's possibility for artificial intelligences to become conscious. So these discussions prompted me to think more about consciousness, especially a few basic questions. What do we mean by consciousness? How do we recognize it? And where does it come from? So that's what this talk will explore. In everyday usage, consciousness seems to be synonymous with awareness. If we lose consciousness, we cease to be aware. We are unaware of our unconscious thoughts and feelings. Someone who wants to make people more aware of some issue may speak of raising their consciousness. But if we simply define consciousness as awareness, we may just be substituting one vague word for another. If we try to pin down what we mean by awareness, the first question would be, awareness of what? Maybe awareness of our physical environment? After all, if we lose consciousness, this is what we cease to be aware of. Does awareness of one's environment qualify as consciousness? The ability to respond to the environment and to changes in it seems to require awareness. If someone gets cold and puts on a jacket, that clearly indicates awareness of their environment. Is it a sign of consciousness? If someone gets cold and doesn't put on a jacket, they shiver. This also shows awareness of their environment. Is there a difference? One requires thought while the other happens spontaneously. Does that matter? Nearly all living things respond to their environment. Even amoebas can locate and capture food. Plants respond to all sorts of environmental conditions. They orient their leaves toward the sun. They open or close stomata on their leaves according to the ambient temperature and humidity. If attacked by herbivores, they produce a greater concentration of bad-tasting chemicals. Even a germinating seed knows up from down. The stem always grows upward and the roots downward. All these things require awareness. Does this have anything to do with consciousness? Many people say yes. The idea that all living things are conscious is embraced by most Hindus and Buddhists, as well as quite a few non-religious people who just think it makes sense. Others object that this is setting the bar too low, that consciousness requires more than the ability to respond to stimuli. They would argue that a street light can turn itself on and off in response to ambient light, but it certainly isn't conscious. What kinds of higher standards have been proposed? Some people believe that consciousness requires thought, or at least some kind of mental activity. They see putting on a jacket in response to cold as a conscious action, while shivering as an unconscious response. The objections to this view are that it's an arbitrary standard and it's anthropocentric. It conveniently limits consciousness to creatures somewhat like ourselves, animals with well-developed brains. And it emphasizes a quality that humans excel in. It's also frequently the result of an unsupported ideological assumption, which I will address later. Strictly in terms of human behavior, it's a pretty convenient distinction, and therefore a popular one. And in spite of the objections to it, it might be a valid way to think about consciousness. But what kinds of mental activity qualify? Are so-called instinctive behaviors evidence of consciousness, or do we insist on rational thought? And how can we accurately judge the mental activity of other species? A still more restrictive standard that's been suggested is that consciousness requires awareness of awareness. Not only are we aware, but we know that we are aware. We are, in effect, conscious of being conscious. This further limitation on consciousness is even more anthropocentric than the previous one, and still arbitrary. It does, however, find some support in certain spiritual practices that encourage us to observe our thoughts so as to become aware of our mental activity, a little bit like being aware of our awareness. Yet another attempt to limit the definition of consciousness is to require that it includes self-consciousness, the awareness of one's own identity. This would conveniently restrict consciousness to a few species of primates, or maybe not. It's quite difficult to determine the extent of another creature's self-awareness. At any rate, this limitation on consciousness is as arbitrary as the others. And from a spiritual perspective, it's misguided. Several spiritual traditions teach that personal identity is an impediment to experiencing true consciousness. Some people take a more metaphysical view of things and believe that consciousness includes an awareness of something beyond the scope of our physical senses and the ordinary workings of our brains. This is consistent with the teachings of some Eastern religions. There is, of course, no way to evaluate this in anyone but oneself, except for the reports of other individuals about themselves. Recognizing it in other species appears to be impossible. I think we should also consider the possibility that consciousness is not necessarily the same in all species. Just as the intelligence of a chickadee differs from the intelligence of a coyote, maybe the consciousness of a maple tree is substantially different from the consciousness of a moose. But then we have to ask, how much can they differ and still be varieties of one thing instead of altogether different things? So far, we haven't considered the very important question, what is the fundamental nature of consciousness? By that I mean, is the consciousness of each individual a distinct and self-contained experience? Or is the consciousness of each individual linked to a collective consciousness? Or is it an expression of a universal consciousness? This question is inextricably entwined with another. Where does consciousness come from? A person's answer to one question will be influenced by their answer to the other. For example, people who have the materialist view of reality that currently dominates our culture will insist that consciousness, like everything else, must originate in the material world. Therefore, they look to the brain as the only possible source. This belief then leads to the conclusion that consciousness requires mental activity, and also the conclusion that consciousness is necessarily an individual phenomenon. It arises independently in each individual's brain. The biggest problem with this theory, and it is a big problem, is that nobody can explain how the brain creates consciousness. Furthermore, no one has identified a part of the brain that is the center of consciousness. In other words, this belief is completely unsupported by evidence. If consciousness originates in the material world, there should be material evidence of its origin, but there is not. An opposing view was very well stated by the physicist Max Planck, who said, quote, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness." End quote. A nearly identical view was expressed by the physicist Erwin Schrödinger. He said, quote, "Consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, for consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else." End quote. Schrödinger was an atheist, but he was quite interested in the Hindu view of reality, which he found to be compatible with many discoveries in quantum physics. In Hinduism and other Eastern religions, the question, where does consciousness come from, is a nonsensical question. Consciousness doesn't come from anywhere. Consciousness just is. All living things participate in it. Some even say that the entire universe participates in it, and that there is some degree of consciousness even in atoms. One proponent of this theory is the physicist Freeman Dyson, who said, quote, "Mind is already inherent in every electron, and the processes of human consciousness differ only in degree, but not in kind, from the processes of choice between quantum states, which we call chance, when they are made by an electron." End quote. If you wonder why I keep quoting physicists instead of gurus or mystics, it's because they have more credibility with skeptical materialists. But be assured that there is extensive support for these ideas in several spiritual traditions. Now, having briefly considered, inconclusively, the nature and origin of consciousness, let's ask the next logical question. Where does it go? What happens to consciousness when we die? Most materialists will confidently answer that consciousness ends at death. If consciousness is the result of brain activity, then obviously when brain activity ends, so does consciousness. But we need to remember that materialism is merely an ideological belief system. It's currently the dominant one, but still just one of many ways of perceiving reality. I've already said that there is no evidence to support the belief that consciousness is created by the brain. There is also no evidence that consciousness is confined to the brain and that it ends with death. In fact, there is considerable evidence to refute these beliefs. First of all, there are out-of-body experiences in which sedated or otherwise unconscious people observe a scene from a vantage point outside their body. They frequently report details that could only have been observed from that vantage point while they were unconscious. This evidence alone would convince me that consciousness is not confined to the brain. Telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and other psychic phenomena are almost impossible to account for if consciousness exists only in the brain. Then there are the so-called near-death experiences, which sometimes happen to people who are not just near death, but actually clinically dead. Yet they are conscious of a non-physical realm of existence in which they participate until they are revived. And finally, there are the very large number of young children who have memories of a past life. None of this evidence proves conclusively that consciousness continues after death, but taken all together, it's pretty persuasive. So if consciousness does not end at death, in what form does it continue? The universal consciousness that we all participate in obviously continues, and we all presumably continue to participate in it. But does our personal consciousness continue? Hinduism and other Eastern religions teach that each person's true nature is the universal consciousness, and our personal identities have no reality. That would suggest that when we die, we shed our personal consciousness and identify only with the universal consciousness. I find that idea very appealing. Unfortunately, the evidence doesn't support it. The Hindu belief is that until we realize our true nature, we continue to identify with an individual consciousness, and we continue to reincarnate. Frankly, I'm not that enthusiastic about the prospect of reincarnating, but that's what the evidence leads me to believe. And that means that each of us retains an individual consciousness after death. Otherwise, children would not identify with some particular past life that they remember. Finally, I guess I should mention the ultimate hardcore materialist view that consciousness simply doesn't exist. Based on what is known about the brain, it cannot be accounted for. The only evidence for its existence is all anecdotal. So the most convenient conclusion is that there is no such thing as consciousness. I can only wonder whether people who adopt this view are aware of their own unconsciousness. So I've asked a lot of questions about consciousness and provided no conclusive answers. I actually think that's quite appropriate. Consciousness is a mystery that defies reductionist materialist explanations. I can only give my personal answers to my questions. What is consciousness? It is some kind of awareness of something. Where does it come from? It doesn't. It just is. Consciousness is neither created nor destroyed. What is its nature? There is a universal consciousness that all living things share, and maybe non-living things also to some degree. Where does it go? It continues after death and rebirth and death and rebirth and death, etc.